On the night of December 24th, 1854, at Whitmore Plantation in Fulton County, Georgia, a 36-year-old enslaved woman named Esther transformed a Christmas banquet into one of the most disturbing and macabre acts of vengeance in the history of American slavery. 14 people, including the plantation owner, his wife, 2 overseers, 3 drivers, 4 neighboring proprietors, and 2 visiting slave traders, consumed human flesh prepared by hands that had lost everything, served on fine porcelain plates, accompanied by French wine and unconscious laughter. The dinner lasted 4 hours. None of them suspected. None of them survived the truth. But this story did not begin on that Christmas night. It began 8 months earlier, in April of 1854, when Master Benjamin Whitmore, known in Atlanta as a refined gentleman and respected member of the Baptist Church, sold Esther's 3 children to different buyers in 3 different states, forever separating a family she had fought for 12 years to keep together. The eldest son, Samuel, 14 years old, was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where children worked until death. The middle daughter, Grace, 11 years old, was purchased by a brothel in New Orleans, her fate sealed before she even turned 12. The youngest, Thomas, only 7 years old, was sold to a South Carolina slave trader who specialized in export to Cuba, where the life expectancy of an enslaved child in the sugarcane fields rarely exceeded 5 years. Esther begged on her knees. She offered to work without rest for the remainder of her life. She promised to never ask for anything again. Whitmore laughed in her face, spat on the ground at her feet, and said, "Negress, you decide nothing. Your children were my property, and property gets sold when the price is right. Be grateful I left you alive to keep cooking." Then he ordered the overseer to give her 50 lashes for insubordination, tied to the whipping post in the courtyard, while the other slaves were forced to watch, so they would learn to accept the will of God and their masters. But Esther did not accept. In that moment, bloodied and shattered on the packed dirt floor, while the April sun burned her open wounds, something inside her died, and something far more dangerous was born. She was head cook of the big house for 16 years. She had unrestricted access to the kitchen, the pantry, the meat cellar, the wine cellars. She knew every eating habit of Master Whitmore, every preference of Mistress Margaret, every allergy of the overseers. She knew when they bought fresh meat, when they slaughtered pigs, when neighboring farms provided lamb. And most importantly, Esther was the daughter of an Igbo healer who had taught her not only about medicinal herbs, but about human anatomy, about meat preservation, about food preparation in ways that white people would never imagine. For 6 months, Esther planned, observed, prepared. She studied every movement on the plantation, every routine of the drivers, every visit from traders and neighboring owners. She waited patiently until Master Whitmore announced, in November, that he would host his traditional Christmas banquet, a pompous celebration where he displayed his wealth, his refined Southern hospitality, and his exceptional Negro cook who prepared the finest dishes in all of Georgia. He had no idea that in that moment he was already serving as the centerpiece on Esther's menu. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological planning, culinary manipulation, and meticulously executed vengeance that would take months to be discovered, and whose horror would echo through the halls of Southern plantations for decades, planting a permanent and visceral fear in every slave master who depended on black cooks to prepare their meals. Whitmore Plantation sat on 840 acres of prime Georgia cotton land, 15 miles southeast of Atlanta, near the Chattahoochee River. The property housed 163 enslaved people, 112 working the cotton fields under brutal conditions, 38 in various craftsman positions, including blacksmithing, carpentry, and textile work, and 13 serving the big house directly. The plantation produced approximately 400 bales of cotton annually, selling at an average price of 11 cents per pound in the Atlanta market, generating substantial wealth for Benjamin Whitmore and his family. The property also maintained extensive vegetable gardens, fruit orchards, hog pens with over 60 animals, cattle pastures, and chicken coops, making it nearly self-sufficient and positioning Whitmore among the wealthier plantation owners in Fulton County. The big house itself was a magnificent two-story Greek Revival structure with 6 massive white columns supporting a wraparound veranda built in 1838 with brick manufactured on-site by enslaved laborers. The interior featured imported Italian marble fireplaces, crystal chandeliers from France, mahogany furniture from the Caribbean, and Persian rugs that cost more than most small farmers earned in a year. The dining room could accommodate 24 guests comfortably, with a table made from a single massive oak tree felled on the property. The kitchen was a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, a common design feature meant to prevent kitchen fires from destroying the main residence and to keep cooking smells away from the refined living spaces. By 1854, tensions over slavery were escalating throughout the nation. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily eased conflicts, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed just months before Esther's children were sold, had reignited fierce debates about slavery's expansion into new territories. In Georgia, plantation owners grew increasingly paranoid about slave rebellions, especially after Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia 23 years earlier continued to haunt white imaginations. County militias conducted regular patrols, slave codes became more restrictive, and punishments grew harsher for any perceived insubordination. The state legislature had recently passed laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read or write, from gathering in groups larger than 7 without white supervision, and from traveling more than 10 miles from their plantation without written passes. Violation of any of these laws could result in whipping, branding, mutilation, or death. The white community in Fulton County operated through interconnected networks of social, economic, and political power. Plantation owners attended the same churches, belonged to the same social clubs, served together on county boards, and frequently visited each other's properties for dinners, hunting parties, and business discussions. Benjamin Whitmore was particularly active in these circles. He served as a deacon at First Baptist Church of Atlanta, held a position on the county agricultural board, and hosted quarterly gatherings where fellow plantation owners discussed cotton prices, shared strategies for controlling their enslaved populations, and reinforced their collective ideology that slavery was divinely ordained and economically necessary. The patrol system in Fulton County was extensive and brutal. Groups of white men, usually poor farmers who owned few or no slaves themselves but aspired to join the planter class, rode through the countryside at night searching for enslaved people traveling without passes, holding unauthorized gatherings, or attempting to escape. These patrollers, called paddy rollers by enslaved people, were authorized to stop, question, search, whip, and even kill any black person found off their plantation after dark. They were paid by the county and given legal immunity for their actions. Their presence created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and terror that made resistance extremely dangerous and escape nearly impossible. Esther was born in 1818, not in America, but in what is now southeastern Nigeria, in a village of the Igbo people near the Cross River. Her mother, Adayeze, was a respected healer and midwife who possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, human anatomy, spiritual practices, and the preparation of substances, both healing and harmful. Esther's early childhood was spent learning these traditions: how to identify dozens of plant species by sight and smell, how to prepare remedies for various ailments, how to assist in difficult births, how to preserve foods through smoking and salting, how to honor ancestors through proper rituals. She lived in a world of extended family, communal agriculture, complex social structures, artistic traditions, and deep spiritual connections to land and lineage. That world ended violently when Esther was 11 years old. Raiders from a rival ethnic group, working with Portuguese slave traders, attacked her village at dawn. She watched her father killed, trying to defend their home. Her mother was beaten unconscious. Esther and 37 others from her village, including her mother, were chained together at the neck and forced to march 300 miles to the coast. The journey took 6 weeks. 15 people died along the way from exhaustion, dehydration, infected wounds, or despair. Their bodies were left where they fell, still chained to the living. When they reached the coast, they were held in underground dungeons at a Portuguese fort for 2 months, while slavers assembled a full cargo. During this time, Esther's mother, weakened by the march and the beatings, contracted dysentery and died, whispering final words to her daughter in their native language. "Remember who you are. Remember our knowledge. It will keep you alive. Use it when the time comes." The Middle Passage across the Atlantic took 7 weeks. Esther was chained in the hold of a Portuguese slave ship named São Miguel with 412 other captives. The space was so confined that they could not sit upright. They lay in their own waste, breathing air so foul that many simply stopped breathing. 63 people died during the voyage from disease, dehydration, despair, or the brutal beatings administered by the crew. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony. Esther survived by following her mother's final instruction. She remembered. She recited in her mind everything her mother had taught her. She sang their songs silently. She honored the memories of her family. She refused to let her spirit break, even as her body was chained and transported like cargo across an ocean to an unknown hell. The ship arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, in August of 1829. Esther and the surviving captives were processed, washed, oiled to make their skin shine, given minimal clothing, and displayed for sale at the city's slave market. She was 11 years old, spoke no English, understood nothing of the alien world around her, and was listed in the auction catalogue simply as Igbo girl, healthy, approximately 11 years, suitable for household training. She was purchased by a middleman trader for $180 and transported by wagon to Atlanta, which was then a small but growing railroad terminus. There she was sold again, this time to Benjamin Whitmore's father, Nathaniel Whitmore, who was assembling a household staff for his newly constructed plantation. For the next 7 years, Esther worked in the big house, under the supervision of an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Martha, who had been born in Virginia and had served as head cook for 40 years. Aunt Martha was demanding but not cruel. She taught Esther English, trained her in Southern cooking techniques, explained the intricate rules of white household expectations, and shared survival strategies for navigating the dangerous world of slavery. During these years, Esther absorbed everything, not just cooking techniques, but the psychology of the masters, the vulnerabilities in the system, the ways that enslaved people could retain small measures of power through knowledge and patience. She learned that white people believed black people incapable of complex thought, that masters routinely discussed plantation business in front of enslaved servants as if they were furniture, that the kitchen was simultaneously a place of intimate access and profound danger. When Esther turned 18, Aunt Martha was dying of consumption. In her final weeks, she took Esther aside and told her, "Child, you got knowledge from your mama across the water, and you got knowledge I taught you here. That's powerful, but power means nothing if you don't know when to use it. Most times you keep your head down, do your work, survive another day. But sometimes there comes a moment when survival ain't enough, when you got to choose between living on your knees or dying on your feet. When that moment comes, You'll know. And when it comes, you use everything you got, everything your mama taught you, everything I taught you, everything you learned watching these white folks. You understand me?" Esther nodded. Aunt Martha died 3 days later. Esther became head cook at age 18. For the next 18 years, Esther perfected her craft. She became known throughout Fulton County as the finest cook in Georgia, capable of preparing elaborate French dishes, traditional Southern meals, delicate pastries, complex sauces, perfectly roasted meats. Master Benjamin Whitmore frequently boasted about his exceptional Negro cook to visitors, occasionally allowing other plantation owners to borrow her services for special occasions. Esther's fried chicken was legendary. Her peach cobbler made grown men weep. Her Christmas ham was discussed in Atlanta society for weeks after each holiday season. She had access to the finest ingredients, the best equipment, detailed cookbooks imported from Europe. She supervised 2 assistant cooks and 3 kitchen helpers. In the strange economy of slavery, her skills made her valuable, which meant she was less likely to be sold, less likely to be whipped for minor infractions, given slightly better clothing and food than field workers. But value is not freedom, and being valuable did not protect what mattered most. In 1842, when Esther was 24, she met Solomon, an enslaved blacksmith who worked on a neighboring plantation owned by a man named Cornelius Jameson. They met at a Sunday church service, one of the few occasions when enslaved people from different plantations could interact under the guise of religious worship. Solomon was 30 years old, born in Virginia, sold south at age 15, trained as a blacksmith by his previous master. He was intelligent, kind, physically strong from years of working hot forges and heavy hammers, and possessed a quiet dignity that had somehow survived 2 decades of bondage. They fell in love. For 2 years, they conducted a courtship that required immense risk and patience. They met on Sundays after church services, speaking in brief, whispered conversations under the watchful eyes of overseers. Solomon obtained a written pass, forged by an enslaved man who had secretly learned to write, despite laws prohibiting literacy, that allowed him to visit Whitmore Plantation twice a month under the pretense of repairing metalwork. These visits gave them precious hours together. They talked about their lives before slavery, Esther's memories of her Igbo village, Solomon's childhood in Virginia. They shared dreams of freedom, of family, of a life where they could be human beings rather than property. They made promises to each other that should have been impossible to keep, but which they swore to honor anyway. In 1844, after months of negotiation between Benjamin Whitmore and Cornelius Jameson, the 2 men agreed to allow a marriage, in quotation marks, because enslaved people had no legal right to marry, could not enter binding contracts, could be separated at any moment if their masters decided to sell one or both partners. But plantation owners sometimes allowed these unions because they believed, correctly, that enslaved people with families were less likely to attempt escape, and because the children born from these unions would be additional property. So Solomon and Esther were permitted to jump the broom in a ceremony held in the quarters at Whitmore Plantation, attended by dozens of enslaved people from both properties. An elderly enslaved preacher named Brother Isaac, who had been granted limited authority to conduct religious services, spoke words over them about love and commitment and faith. They jumped over a broom together, an African-derived tradition that symbolized sweeping away the old life and stepping into a new one. And for one day, they were allowed to feel almost human. Their first child, Samuel, was born in April of 1845. Despite the horror of bringing a child into slavery, despite knowing that their son would be property rather than a free person, Esther and Solomon felt joy. Samuel was healthy, intelligent, curious. Esther taught him everything she could, not just survival skills, but the fragments of Igbo language and traditions she still remembered from her mother. Solomon taught him to work metal, to read the stars for direction, to stand straight and look at the horizon even when beaten down. Master Whitmore allowed Solomon to visit every 2 weeks. It was not enough, it was never enough, but it was what they had. Grace was born in 1846, Thomas in 1850. Each birth brought the same complicated mixture of love, joy, and grief. Love for these small human beings, joy in their existence, grief that their existence meant being born into chains. Esther devoted herself to her children with ferocious intensity. She made sure they had enough to eat, often sacrificing her own portions. She told them stories every night about their grandmother Adais, about the village across the ocean, about their father's strength. She taught Grace the beginnings of cooking skills, showed Samuel how to identify medicinal plants, sang Thomas the Igbo lullabies her mother had sung to her. She fought to give them childhoods, knowing that childhood for enslaved children was brutally short, that Samuel would be sent to the fields at age 10, that Grace would face horrors Esther could barely speak of, that Thomas would be worked until his small body broke. For 12 years, Esther maintained this impossible balance. She worked 16-hour days in the big house kitchen, cooking elaborate meals for the Whitmore family and their constant stream of guests. She raised her 3 children with Solomon during his twice-monthly visits and the rare occasions when she could bring them to see him at Jameson Plantation. She preserved her mother's knowledge, maintaining small garden plots where she grew both cooking herbs and medicinal plants, some of which had properties the white people did not understand. She survived. She endured. She told herself that survival was enough, that keeping her family together was the only victory possible in a system designed to destroy black families. She believed that if she could just keep them all alive, keep them together, somehow they would find their way to freedom. She had faith, not in white people's God, but in the ancestors, in the spirits her mother had taught her about, in the possibility of justice that might take generations, but would eventually come. That faith shattered on April 7th, 1854. If you're wondering how a mother survives 12 years protecting her children only to lose them in a single day, you're beginning to understand the calculated cruelty of American slavery. This was not random violence. This was systematic destruction of black families, designed to break spirits, eliminate resistance, and maximize profit. And it happened every single day across the American South. Master Benjamin Whitmore was 48 years old in 1854, a tall man standing 6 feet and 1 inch, with graying brown hair always carefully styled with pomade, piercing blue eyes that missed nothing, a neatly trimmed beard in the fashionable style of wealthy Southern gentlemen, and soft hands that had never performed manual labor. He wore expensive suits imported from Charleston, gold watch chains, custom leather boots. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been told no, never faced consequences, never doubted his right to own other human beings. He smelled of expensive tobacco, bourbon, and the cologne he ordered from France twice a year. Benjamin Whitmore's grandfather had arrived in Georgia in 1792 with money made from tobacco plantations in Virginia. His father, Nathaniel, expanded the family holdings, purchasing the land that would become Whitmore Plantation in 1836. Benjamin inherited the property in 1848 when Nathaniel died of a heart attack. He immediately set about expanding operations, increasing cotton acreage, purchasing additional enslaved people, investing in the latest agricultural equipment, building his reputation as a progressive and scientific farmer who applied modern business principles to plantation management. He gave speeches at agricultural meetings about crop rotation, soil conservation, efficient use of slave labor. He wrote articles for Southern agricultural journals. He positioned himself as a leader among Georgia planters, a voice of reason and refinement. But beneath the refined exterior lived a man of casual, everyday brutality. Whitmore believed absolutely in the racial ideologies that justified slavery. that black people were inherently inferior, childlike, incapable of self-governance, requiring the firm guidance of white masters for their own good. He read and believed the pseudo-scientific texts of the era that claimed to prove black intellectual inferiority. He attended church every Sunday and listened to sermons explaining that slavery was ordained by God, that the curse of Ham justified black servitude, that masters who treated their slaves well were fulfilling Christian duty. He saw no contradiction between his professed Christianity and the violence he inflicted. He believed himself a good master because he provided adequate food rations, did not permit sexual violence against enslaved women on his property, though he turned a blind eye to his overseers' behavior, and only used the whip for disciplinary purposes rather than entertainment. By these warped standards, he was indeed better than some masters. But better is not good, and Whitmore's idea of discipline was brutal by any measure. He maintained a whipping post in the courtyard where punishments were administered publicly to set an example. He believed in psychological control as much as physical violence, separating families as punishment, selling children away from parents, destroying any hint of hope or happiness among his enslaved population. He kept meticulous financial records, tracking every expense, every purchase, every sale. To him, enslaved people were capital investments, pieces on a balance sheet, resources to be maximized for profit. In early 1854, Whitmore faced a cash flow problem. Cotton prices had dropped due to increased production across the South. He had borrowed heavily to expand his operations and purchased new equipment. Several large debts were coming due. He needed liquid capital quickly. The fastest way to raise cash was to sell assets, and enslaved people were his most liquid assets. He consulted his financial records, calculating which enslaved people could be sold with minimal disruption to plantation operations. Field workers were out. He needed them for the upcoming planting season. Craftsmen were too valuable. But the children of house servants, they were surplus, not yet productive enough to be missed, old enough to command decent prices, perfect for converting into cash. Esther's children fit his calculations perfectly. Samuel, at 14, was strong enough for field work and could be sold to a Mississippi cotton plantation for $900. Grace, at 11, was approaching the age when she could be sold to certain specialized markets for significantly higher prices. Whitmore brokered a sale to a New Orleans brothel owner for $600, telling himself he was not responsible for what happened to her after the sale was complete. Thomas, at 7, was small but healthy. A South Carolina trader specializing in Cuban export offered $500 for him. Total return, $2,000, more than enough to cover Whitmore's immediate debts and finance his planned expansion of the cotton gin operation. Mistress Margaret Whitmore, Benjamin's wife, was 42 years old, a woman of medium height with dark hair going gray. Pale skin she protected obsessively from the sun, with parasols and wide-brimmed hats and a thin-lipped mouth that rarely smiled. She had been raised in Charleston society, the daughter of a merchant family that made its fortune trading in rice, indigo, and enslaved people. She had been taught from childhood that her role was to manage a proper Christian household, provide children for her husband. She had given him 4 daughters who survived to adulthood and 2 sons who died in infancy, and maintained the social graces expected of a plantation mistress. She supervised the house slaves, planned menus, organized social gatherings, managed household accounts, visited neighbors, and attended church services where she sat in the front pew, reserved for planter families. Margaret was not physically violent herself. She considered direct violence beneath her station, something overseers should handle. But her cruelty was psychological and pervasive. She was obsessed with the idea that enslaved people were constantly stealing from her, plotting against her, laughing at her behind her back. She conducted surprise inspections of the quarters, searching for any item she claimed belonged to the big house. She listened at doors, trying to overhear conversations. She demanded absolute deference. Enslaved people had to look down when speaking to her, refer to her as Mistress Margaret, move out of her way immediately when she passed. Any perceived slight resulted in punishment, usually administered by the overseer based on her complaints. She was particularly harsh toward enslaved women she considered attractive, viewing them as threats to her marriage. She found reasons to have them reassigned to field work, sold away, or punished for imagined infractions. She took particular interest in the children of enslaved women, monitoring them constantly, restricting their movements, ensuring they never forgot their place. When Benjamin informed her of his decision to sell Esther's children, Margaret expressed neither concern nor objection. "Those Negro children eat our food and contribute nothing," she said. "It's only prudent business. Besides, that Esther has been getting above herself lately. She needs to remember who she belongs to. Selling her children will teach her proper humility." The overseer of Whitmore Plantation was a man named Caleb Morrison, age 36, originally from North Carolina. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall with a muscular build from years of physical work, reddish-brown hair, a thick beard, scarred hands, and cold grey eyes that rarely showed emotion. Morrison had been hired by Benjamin Whitmore in 1851 after the previous overseer died of malaria. He came with strong recommendations from 2 other plantation owners who praised his ability to maintain discipline without causing excessive damage to valuable property. Morrison was not a plantation owner himself. He was from a poor white family that owned no land and no slaves. His position as overseer was his path to accumulating capital, gaining status, eventually perhaps purchasing his own small farm and enslaved workers. He earned an annual salary of $400 plus housing and food, but his real ambition was to save enough to enter the planter class himself. Morrison's methods were calculated rather than sadistic. He believed in systematic intimidation, making examples of rule breakers, maintaining constant surveillance, using just enough violence to establish control without causing injuries that would reduce productivity. He carried a leather whip at all times, a braided bullwhip 7 feet long that he knew how to use with precision. He could draw blood with a single strike or simply create a loud crack for intimidation. He rode through the fields multiple times daily on a tall black horse, observing work pace, noting anyone who appeared to be moving slowly or taking unauthorized breaks. He had the authority to order punishments up to 25 lashes without consulting Master Whitmore. Anything more required permission, but was rarely denied. Morrison had particular responsibility for controlling movement on and off the plantation. He inspected all passes, questioned anyone traveling between properties, supervised the Sunday church services where enslaved people from multiple plantations gathered. He coordinated with county patrollers, providing them with descriptions of anyone who ran away. He maintained detailed records of each enslaved person's location, work assignment, and behavior. To him, plantation management was a science requiring careful observation, consistent enforcement, and absolute authority. He viewed enslaved people as fundamentally different from white people, not quite human, requiring firm control, incapable of self-discipline. He felt no personal animosity toward them, but he felt no compassion either. They were work animals to be managed, and he was good at his job. The plantation also employed 3 drivers, enslaved men promoted to positions of limited authority over other slaves. The head driver was a man named Marcus, age 42, who had been born on the plantation and had served in this role for 8 years. Drivers occupied a complicated position in the plantation hierarchy. They were still enslaved, still property, still subject to violence from white overseers and masters. but they had slightly more privileges: better food rations, separate housing, exemption from fieldwork, small payments in cash or goods. In exchange, they were expected to maintain work discipline among other enslaved people, report rule violations, and sometimes administer punishments themselves. This made them simultaneously powerful and hated within the enslaved community, necessary for their own survival, but viewed as traitors to their own people. Marcus had made his choice years ago. He believed, or told himself he believed, that cooperation with the system was the only path to survival, that resistance led only to death. That his role as driver allowed him to sometimes soften punishments or warn people before they got into serious trouble. But everyone knew he reported directly to Morrison, that information shared with Marcus often reached white ears, that trusting him was dangerous. Other enslaved people interacted with him when necessary, but kept their distance, spoke carefully around him, excluded him from the whispered conversations in the quarters after dark. This was Esther's world in April of 1854. She had lived in it for 25 years. She had mastered its rules, navigated its dangers, found the small spaces where life could exist within oppression. She had her work, her skills, her reputation. She had Solomon's twice-monthly visits. Most importantly, she had her children. Samuel was growing into a thoughtful young man who asked questions about the world beyond the plantation. Grace was learning to cook, sitting beside her mother in the kitchen, absorbing techniques and knowledge. Thomas was still young enough to laugh, to play with other children in the quarters on Sunday afternoons, to believe in the stories Esther told him about flying people and clever animals who outwitted predators. These children were her life's meaning, her reason for enduring, her only joy in an existence defined by suffering. On April 7th, that ended. The day began normally. Esther woke before dawn in her small cabin in the quarters, a single room with a dirt floor, rough wooden walls with gaps that let in cold air and rain, a fireplace that provided heat and cooking, a single window with wooden shutters. She shared this space with her 3 children, sleeping together on pallets of straw covered with rough blankets. Solomon was not there. His last visit had been 3 days earlier. His next visit would be in 11 more days. Esther rose quietly. Careful not to wake the children, lit the fire, warmed water in an iron pot, washed her face and hands, changed into her work dress, a simple cotton garment, patched multiple times, faded from countless washings. She looked at her sleeping children. Samuel on his back, one arm thrown over his head, already nearly as tall as she was. Grace curled on her side, thumb near her mouth like when she was a baby. Thomas pressed against his sister for warmth, small and perfect and vulnerable. Esther felt the familiar mixture of love and grief. They should be free. They should wake up in their own home, eat meals without fear, play without supervision, learn to read and write, grow up to choose their own paths. Instead, they were property, owned by Benjamin Whitmore, their futures determined by his financial calculations. She walked to the big house in the pre-dawn darkness, crossing the yard where the whipping post stood, passing the overseer's cabin where Caleb Morrison was likely still asleep, entering the kitchen through the back door. The kitchen was already warming. One of her assistant cooks, a young woman named Dinah, had arrived earlier to start the stove fires. Esther began preparations for breakfast: biscuits, gravy, fried eggs, bacon, grits, coffee. The Whitmore family expected breakfast served precisely at 7 o'clock. The work was automatic, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind wandered to pleasanter thoughts. In 4 days, Solomon would visit. Maybe she could steal a few hours with him while the Whitmore family attended a social event. Maybe they could walk together beyond the immediate plantation grounds, pretending for a brief time that they were free people taking an evening stroll rather than property granted temporary permission to exist in proximity. At 6:45, Caleb Morrison entered the kitchen. This was unusual. He typically took breakfast in his own cabin. Esther looked up, immediately alert. Morrison's face was neutral, revealing nothing. "Master wants to see you in his study after breakfast service," he said. "Don't keep him waiting." Then he turned and left. Esther felt unease settle in her stomach. Master Whitmore rarely summoned her to his study. Usually any instructions came through Mistress Margaret or were delivered to the kitchen by house servants. A direct summons meant something unusual. She continued working, served breakfast to the family, supervised the cleanup, then walked to the main house. Benjamin Whitmore's study was on the first floor, a wood-paneled room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk, leather chairs, and a large window overlooking the cotton fields. When Esther entered after knocking, she found Whitmore seated behind his desk, papers spread before him, an ink pen in his hand. He did not look up immediately. Making people wait was a power tactic he employed frequently. Finally, he raised his eyes. "Esther," he said conversationally, "your cooking continues to be excellent. My guests this week commented favorably on the ham." "Thank you, Master," Esther said quietly, eyes lowered in the required position of deference. "I've been reviewing the plantation accounts," Whitmore continued. "As you may know, running an operation of this size requires significant capital investment, equipment, supplies, labor costs, taxes, debts. A wise manager must constantly evaluate assets and make difficult decisions to ensure long-term stability." He paused. Esther's heart began to beat faster. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She could feel it. "I've made a decision regarding your children," Whitmore said. "Samuel, Grace, and Thomas will be sold. The transactions are already arranged. Samuel leaves tomorrow for Mississippi. Grace will be transported to New Orleans on Thursday. Thomas goes to South Carolina on Friday. The buyers have paid in full. The decision is final." The words hit Esther like physical blows. For a moment she could not breathe, could not think, could not process what she had just heard. Sold, all three, different states. Gone. "Master," she said, and her voice came out as a whisper. "Please." "Master, please don't do this. They children. They belong here with me. I work hard. I never complain. I do anything you want. Please, please don't take my children." Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. She was begging now, violating every rule of plantation conduct, but she did not care. "Master, please, I'm begging you. Take me instead. Sell me. Whip me. I'll work double. I'll never ask for nothing again. Just don't take my children. Please, Master, please, have mercy. For the love of God, have mercy on me." Whitmore's expression did not change. "Your children are my property, Esther. I can dispose of my property as I see fit. You should be grateful. Many masters sell mothers away from their children. I'm allowing you to remain here. You'll continue your work in the kitchen. You'll have time to adjust to this change. You will not make a scene. You will not try to interfere with the transactions. If you do, I'll have Morrison give you 100 lashes and sell you south, where conditions are far worse than what you experience here. Do I make myself clear?" Esther's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, hands clasped in front of her, tears streaming down her face. "Master, please, they're babies. Samuel just 14, Grace only 11, Thomas just 7 years old. They need their mama. Please don't do this. I'll never ask for nothing else. I'll serve you my whole life. Just let me keep my children, please. I'm begging you on my knees, please." Whitmore stood up, walked around his desk, looked down at the weeping woman on his floor. "You are upset," he said, his voice flat. "That's understandable. You're becoming emotional, which is natural for your race. But you need to accept God's will and your master's decision. Your children will be fine. They'll have new homes, new work, new opportunities to serve their new masters. This is how the world works, Esther. Now get up, go back to your work, and do not speak of this matter again." Esther remained on her knees, her body shaking with sobs. "Please," she whispered one more time. "Please." Whitmore's face hardened. He walked to his desk, picked up a small bell, rang it. Caleb Morrison entered within seconds. He had been waiting outside. "Morrison," Whitmore said, "this woman is being hysterical. Take her to the whipping post. 50 lashes. Make sure the other house servants watch. They need to understand that emotional displays will not be tolerated." Morrison grabbed Esther by the arm, pulled her to her feet, dragged her from the study. She could not resist. Her legs would not work properly. Her mind could not accept what was happening. This could not be real. This could not be happening. Her children, her babies, gone. Different states. She would never see them again, never hold them, never tell them stories, never teach them, never watch them grow. Gone. In the courtyard, Morrison tied her hands to the whipping post, securing them above her head with rough hemp rope that cut into her wrists. He tore open the back of her dress, exposing her skin to the April morning air. Several house servants had gathered, forced to witness the punishment. Dinah was there, tears streaming down her face. 2 other kitchen workers. The house butler, an elderly man named Silas, who had served the Whitmore family for 40 years. A stable boy. Morrison uncoiled his whip. The first strike landed across her shoulders. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Esther cried out. The second strike came, the third. Morrison counted each one aloud. 4, 5, 6. The whip cut through skin, raising welts, drawing blood. 10, 11, 12. Esther stopped screaming after 20 lashes. She simply hung from the post, her body jerking with each impact, blood running down her back, soaking into her ruined dress. 25, 26, 27. She thought of her mother a daze, dying in the underground dungeon in Africa, whispering final words. "Use your knowledge when the time comes." 38, 39, 40. She thought of Aunt Martha's last warning, sometimes survival ain't enough. 48, 49, 50. Morrison stepped back, coiled his whip. "Cut her down," he told the stable boy. They released the ropes. Esther collapsed onto the packed earth of the courtyard. She could not move. Every nerve in her body screamed. Blood pooled beneath her. The sun had risen higher now, warming the April morning. From this angle, lying on the ground, she could see the cotton fields beyond the courtyard, rows of dark earth recently ploughed, ready for planting. She could hear birds singing, life continuing as if nothing had happened. Dinah and another woman helped her back to her cabin. They laid her on her pallet, carefully positioning her on her stomach, since her back was destroyed. They brought water, tried to clean the wounds, but the damage was too severe for basic remedies. The torn flesh burned. Esther's children were at the cabin. They had been brought back from their morning tasks. Samuel knelt beside his mother, his young face contorted with rage and helplessness. Grace sobbed. Thomas, not fully understanding, touched his mother's hand and asked, "Mama hurt?" Through waves of pain, Esther forced herself to speak. "They selling you," she whispered. "All 3 of you, different places. Tomorrow they take Samuel. Thursday they take Grace. Friday they take Thomas." She watched their faces change as comprehension hit. Samuel's expression shifted from confusion to horror to fury. Grace began to wail. Thomas started crying because his siblings were crying. "I tried to stop it," Esther whispered. "I begged. He wouldn't listen. I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't protect you. I couldn't save you." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry." Samuel put his hand on his mother's shoulder, careful to avoid the wounds. "Mama, this not your fault," he said. "You did everything you could. This their fault. Master's fault. This evil they doing, not you." They stayed together for the rest of that day and through the night. Solomon arrived in the evening. Someone had sent him word, probably Brother Isaac from the quarters, passing information through the underground network that enslaved people maintained, despite prohibitions on communication between plantations. Solomon held Esther as carefully as possible, his strong body shaking with grief and rage. He held his children. He told them stories about his childhood in Virginia, about his father and grandfather, about the family history they would carry with them wherever they went. He told Samuel to be strong, to remember who he was, to survive. He told Grace that her mother loved her more than life itself. He held Thomas and cried. The next morning a wagon arrived. Samuel was taken. He did not struggle. He knew that resistance would only make things worse for his mother and siblings. But as he was lifted into the wagon, chained at the ankles to prevent escape attempts during transport, he looked back at his family. "I'll remember you," he said. "I'll remember everything. I'll survive. And if I ever get free, I'll come find you." Then the wagon pulled away, heading toward Mississippi, where a cotton plantation awaited an additional field hand. On Thursday, Grace was taken. The man who came for her was well-dressed, smooth-talking, and utterly indifferent to the child's tears. He explained to Mistress Margaret, within earshot of Esther, that Grace would receive proper training in New Orleans and would serve in a respectable establishment catering to gentlemen of means. Margaret nodded approvingly. "Waste not, want not," she said. "These Negro children need to learn their purpose early." On Friday, Thomas was taken. He was so small that the slave trader lifted him with one hand and set him in the wagon alongside 3 other children, being transported to South Carolina for eventual shipment to Cuban sugar plantations. Thomas did not understand fully what was happening. He kept asking, "When I see Mama again?" The trader did not answer. Esther, still barely able to move from the whipping, crawled to the edge of the plantation boundary and watched the wagon disappear into the distance. When she could no longer see it, she remained there, kneeling in the dirt, staring at the empty road. Something inside her died that day. The part of her that had maintained hope, that had believed in survival, that had found ways to endure the unendurable. That part simply ceased to exist. What remained was different, colder, harder, focused on a single purpose. She crawled back to her cabin. She did not return to work for a week. Her back began to heal slowly, the deep wounds scabbing over, though the scars would remain forever. During that week she did not speak. She barely ate. She sat in her empty cabin, staring at the places where her children had slept, and thought about revenge. Aunt Martha's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes survival ain't enough. Sometimes there comes a moment when you got to choose between living on your knees or dying on your feet. When that moment comes, you use everything you got." Her mother's voice whispered across the years. "Use your knowledge when the time comes." Esther realized that the time had come. She was 36 years old. She had been enslaved for 25 years. She had endured the Middle Passage, the separation from her mother, decades of servitude, the constant fear and degradation. She had tried to build a life within impossible constraints. She had protected her children with every resource available to her, and it had not been enough. The system had taken them anyway. Because in slavery, black families had no protection, no rights, no guarantee of anything except suffering. Benjamin Whitmore had made a calculation. He had weighed the financial benefit of selling 3 children against the emotional devastation of their mother, and he had decided the money was worth more. He had assumed that Esther, like all enslaved people in his experience, would eventually accept this loss, would return to work, would continue cooking his meals and serving his needs because she had no choice. He assumed that 50 lashes had reinforced the power dynamic, had reminded her of her place, had eliminated any possibility of resistance. He was wrong. During the week Esther spent recovering, she began to plan, and her plan was not escape. She knew escape was nearly impossible. A single black woman traveling alone would be stopped immediately by patrollers, had no resources for a journey north, would be caught and returned for horrific punishment. Escape meant leaving behind Solomon and the few people she cared about in the quarters. Escape meant running while her enemies lived comfortably, never facing consequences for their crimes. No, Esther did not want to escape. She wanted justice. And since the law offered no justice for enslaved people, since God seemed deaf to her prayers, since the entire system was designed to protect white masters and destroy black families, she would create her own justice. She was the head cook. She had access to everything the Whitmore family ate. She had knowledge of herbs, plants, anatomy, and food preparation that stretched back to her mother's teachings in an Igbo village and forward through 16 years of training in southern kitchens. She had Aunt Martha's wisdom about when to fight and how to fight. She had detailed knowledge of every routine, every habit, every vulnerability of the people who had destroyed her life. Most importantly, she had time. The Whitmore family expected her to return to work eventually. They expected submission. They expected fear. They would get patience instead. Careful, meticulous, intelligent patience. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This was the daily reality of American slavery. Families destroyed for profit, children sold away from parents, legal protections non-existent, the entire weight of state and federal law designed to support this system of exploitation and terror. Esther's story was not unusual. Thousands of enslaved families were separated exactly this way, every single day, for 246 years. This is the history that made America wealthy. This is the truth that textbooks minimize. This is the foundation upon which American capitalism was built. After a week, Esther returned to work. She moved slowly at first, her back still healing, but she worked efficiently. She did not speak unnecessarily. She did not make eye contact with Benjamin or Margaret Whitmore. She kept her head down, her expression neutral, her behavior submissive. Exactly what they expected. Exactly what they wanted to see, a broken woman who had accepted her place. But in the privacy of her cabin at night, in the early mornings before dawn, during the rare hours when she was not being watched, Esther began her real work. She began to study. She observed Master Whitmore's daily routine with new intensity. He woke at 7 o'clock every morning. He took breakfast at 7:30. Eggs, the bacon, biscuits, gravy, coffee. He spent mornings in his study reviewing accounts, writing correspondence, meeting with his overseer. He took midday dinner at 12:30, the main meal of the day, typically including meat, vegetables, bread, dessert. He spent afternoons either inspecting the fields or meeting with neighboring plantation owners. He took a light supper at 6:30. He retired to his study after supper for bourbon and cigars. He went to bed at 10 o'clock. Mistress Margaret woke at 8 o'clock. She took breakfast at 8:30 in her room. Tea, toast, jam, fruit. She spent mornings supervising house servants and planning menus. She took midday dinner with her husband. She spent afternoons engaged in needlework, reading religious texts, or making social calls to neighboring plantations. She took supper with her husband. She retired to her bedroom at 9 o'clock, an hour before Benjamin. Caleb Morrison took his meals in his cabin, food prepared by the kitchen, and brought to him 3 times daily. He woke at dawn. He rode through the fields throughout the day. He supervised evening distribution of rations to the quarters. He went to bed around 10 o'clock, but kept a loaded rifle by his bed and woke at any unusual sound. The drivers ate with the other enslaved people, taking rations from the communal food distribution. They slept in the quarters. They were, in many ways, easier targets. But killing drivers would not satisfy what Esther needed. She needed the masters to pay. For 2 months, Esther simply observed and cooked. She maintained her usual quality. The Whitmore family noticed no change in the food. Benjamin even commented on one occasion that her fried chicken was even better than usual, if that's possible. Margaret told guests that despite the recent unpleasantness of selling some Negro children, an unfortunate necessity of plantation economics, the cook had returned to work without issue, proving that proper discipline maintained order. They had no idea that Esther was conducting an education. Every meal she prepared became a study session. She observed what foods the Whitmore family preferred, what dishes they always ate fully, what times of day their guards were lowest. She began experimenting with flavors, noting which spices and seasonings could mask subtle changes in taste. She tested the limits of how much variation she could introduce before anyone noticed. During this time, Solomon visited twice. Esther told him what she was planning. Not the details. She would not implicate him, would not give him information that could be tortured out of him if her plan was discovered. But she told him enough that he understood. "They took our children," she said. "They took everything. I can't live knowing they just continue on, happy and comfortable and rich, while Samuel works himself to death in Mississippi fields, while Grace faces horrors in New Orleans, while Thomas dies cutting sugarcane in Cuba. I can't live with that." Solomon held her. "What you planning? It's dangerous," he said. "It might end with you dead." "I'm already dead," Esther replied. "The woman who wanted to survive, who hoped for better, who believed in anything good. That woman died when they took my babies. What's left is just the part that's going to make them pay." Solomon was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I understand. If I was in your place, I'd do the same. Whatever you need from me, whatever I can provide, you tell me. And Esther, when you do this thing, you make it count. You make it mean something. You make every master in Georgia scared to sleep at night. You make them understand that black people ain't property. We're human beings, and human beings fight back." In June of 1854, Esther began the next phase. She started collecting resources. First, she needed to understand her options. She had knowledge of many plants from her mother's teaching and her own years of observation. Some were medicinal, some were poisonous. The question was which poisons were available, how they could be obtained without suspicion, how they worked, how much was needed, and how they could be delivered without detection. She began with foxglove, which grew wild in several locations around the plantation. Foxglove contains digitalis, a compound that affects heart rhythm. In proper doses, it can be medicinal. In larger doses, it causes nausea, vomiting, irregular heartbeat, and death. Esther collected small amounts of foxglove leaves during her rare hours of free time on Sundays, always taking only a few from each plant so the collection would not be obvious. She dried the leaves carefully in her cabin, grinding them into powder using a smooth rock and a wooden bowl. She tested the powder on a rat she caught in the kitchen storeroom. She mixed a small amount into a piece of meat and left it where the rat would find it. The rat ate, seemed fine for an hour, then began showing distress. 2 hours after ingestion, it died. Esther performed a crude dissection. Her mother had taught her basic anatomy. The rat's heart showed clear signs of damage. The poison worked, but foxglove had limitations. It was bitter tasting, which meant it would need to be heavily masked in food. The amount needed to kill an adult human was substantial, probably a full tablespoon of concentrated powder per person. It was too slow. Symptoms took hours to develop, which meant potential discovery before all targets were affected. And it would be obvious that poison had been used, which would lead to investigation, torture of enslaved people to extract confessions, and brutal retribution. Esther needed something better. She turned her attention to oleander, another plant that grew on the plantation grounds. Mistress Margaret had several oleander bushes planted near the big house because she liked their pink flowers. Every part of the oleander plant is toxic, containing compounds that disrupt heart function. But oleander also had the same problems as foxglove. Bitter taste, substantial amount needed, slow action, obvious poisoning. For 2 months, Esther conducted quiet research. She tested various plants on rats, observing onset times, symptoms, effectiveness of different doses. She experimented with mixing poisons to see if combinations were more effective. She consulted with an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Reba, who had been born in Africa and who still remembered some traditional knowledge about plants, though Esther was careful to ask in ways that did not reveal her intentions. By August, Esther had concluded that plant-based poisons, while available, were not ideal for her purpose. They required large amounts, were difficult to fully mask in food, and would clearly indicate poisoning. She needed something else. That's when she realized the answer had been in front of her the entire time. She did not need to poison the Whitmore family and their friends. She needed to make them eat something that would destroy them psychologically, socially, and legally, something that would not kill them immediately, but would ruin them forever once discovered. She needed them to unknowingly consume human flesh. The idea came to her in September. She was preparing a roast for Sunday dinner, working with a large cut of pork shoulder. She looked at the meat, pale pink flesh marbled with fat, similar in color and texture to human skin. She thought about her knowledge of anatomy, about butchering techniques, about the fact that humans had long known in the darkest moments of history that human flesh could be prepared and consumed just like any other meat. Cannibalism had occurred in desperate situations throughout history, during sieges, famines, shipwrecks, and in some cultures it had been ritualized. The point was not that human flesh was somehow fundamentally different from animal flesh in terms of preparation. The point was the profound psychological and moral violation it represented. If she could make the Whitmore family and their associates consume human flesh without knowing it, if she could then reveal the truth, she would accomplish something no poison could achieve. She would not just kill them, she would destroy them morally, socially, and psychologically. They would be revealed as cannibals, violators of one of humanity's deepest taboos. Their reputations would be ruined, their social standing would collapse. Their neighbors would be horrified. They would face charges under Georgia law. Cannibalism was not explicitly illegal, but the circumstances would lead to prosecution for murder, abuse of a corpse, conspiracy. They would be forever marked as monsters, and even if legal charges somehow did not stick, even if they tried to deny everything, the mere accusation would destroy them in Southern society. White Christian plantation owners who unknowingly ate human flesh. The scandal would spread across the entire South. Benjamin Whitmore's name would be forever associated with this horror. His family would be ostracized. His business relationships would collapse. He would lose everything that mattered to him: reputation, status, social standing. More importantly, the story would spread among enslaved people throughout the South. It would become a legend, a whispered tale of resistance, a proof that slaves could fight back in ways masters never imagined. It would plant fear in the hearts of every plantation owner who depended on black cooks to prepare their food. It would demonstrate that proximity to power could become a weapon, that trust could be exploited, that the enslaved people moving silently through big houses were not passive objects, but intelligent human beings capable of extraordinary revenge. The psychological impact on the perpetrators themselves would be devastating. Once they learned the truth, once they knew what they had consumed, once they realized they had eaten human flesh, the trauma would be permanent and inescapable. Every meal they had enjoyed would be recontextualized. Every bite they had savored would become a source of horror. The memory would invade their dreams, poison their thoughts, destroy any peace they might find. They would be haunted forever by the knowledge of what they had done, what they had become, and the perfect poetic justice. They would have no one to blame but themselves. Their own greed, Their own cruelty, their own system of slavery, had created the conditions for this revenge. They had treated human beings as objects, as property to be used and disposed of at will. Now they would learn, in the most horrific way possible, the consequences of that dehumanization. They had consumed what they created. But implementing this plan required solving enormous logistical and moral challenges. Esther needed a source of human flesh. She needed to obtain it without discovery. She needed to prepare it in ways that would be indistinguishable from conventional meat. She needed to serve it at a time when maximum targets would be present. And she needed a method of eventual revelation that would expose the truth without immediately leading to her own capture and execution. The problem of source was the most difficult. Esther could not kill someone herself to obtain the flesh. Murder would require disposing of a body, would create a missing person, would lead to investigation. She could not use corpses from the plantation burial ground. Those bodies were buried within hours of death, often in shared graves, watched by overseers to prevent any African burial traditions that masters feared contained coded resistance messages. Then Esther remembered something from 3 years earlier. In 1851, a young enslaved man named Jacob had attempted to escape from a neighboring plantation. He had been caught by patrollers 10 miles north, trying to reach the Ohio River. The standard punishment for attempted escape was brutal whipping, followed by either sale to the Deep South or execution as a warning. But the man who owned Jacob, a plantation owner named Richard Thornton, had decided on a different punishment. He had ordered Jacob hanged and then had kept the body displayed on a wooden post at the plantation entrance for 2 weeks before finally allowing burial. The purpose was intimidation, a visceral reminder to all enslaved people of the consequences of resistance. What Esther remembered was the conversation she had overheard between Benjamin Whitmore and another plantation owner during a social visit to the big house. They had been discussing Thornton's punishment of Jacob, debating its effectiveness as a deterrent. One man had commented that displaying bodies for extended periods was unsanitary and attracted animals, which created health risks. But another had argued that the psychological impact justified the temporary unpleasantness, and then someone had mentioned that Thornton had not even buried the body after 2 weeks. He had simply had his overseer drag it into the woods beyond the plantation boundary and leave it there for scavengers. "Saves the trouble of digging a grave," the man had said. Others had laughed. This conversation had stayed with Esther because it revealed something important. There were bodies of executed or brutalized enslaved people that were sometimes disposed of carelessly, left in locations where recovery might be possible for someone who knew where to look and was willing to take the risk. Over the next 2 months, Esther made careful inquiries through the underground network of communication between plantations. She asked questions in ways that would not reveal her intentions, mentioning in conversation with other enslaved people during Sunday church services that she had heard stories about masters leaving bodies unburied, wondering if anyone knew of recent cases. The information came back slowly, passed through several people, but eventually Esther learned of 2 situations. First, a 50-year-old enslaved man named Josiah, who had died from infection after a brutal whipping on a plantation 30 miles south, had been left in a shallow grave near the edge of the property because the ground was too hard to dig properly, and the overseer did not want to spend the time or labor on proper burial. Second, an enslaved woman named Ruth, who had died during childbirth on a plantation 20 miles east. Her body and the stillborn infant had been buried in an unmarked grave in woods beyond the plantation cemetery because the master considered the death shameful and did not want it commemorated. Both of these graves were on plantation property, which meant accessing them would be extremely dangerous. But Esther had an advantage. She was trusted. After 16 years of exemplary service, she had privileges that most enslaved people did not. She could request permission to visit other plantations for legitimate reasons, to consult with another plantation's cook about a complex recipe, to attend a church service at a different location, to help prepare food for a large social gathering hosted by a neighboring owner. These requests had been granted multiple times in the past. They would be granted again. In October of 1854, Esther requested permission from Benjamin Whitmore to visit the plantation where Josiah had been buried. She explained that she had heard they had an exceptional cook who had developed a new technique for preparing ham, and she wanted to learn this technique to improve the Christmas feast she would prepare for the Whitmore family in December. Whitmore, pleased with the idea of an even more impressive Christmas dinner, gave permission. Mistress Margaret wrote a pass, a piece of paper, stating that Esther had permission to travel to the specified plantation and return within 2 days. Esther made the journey on foot, walking 30 miles over 2 days. She arrived at the plantation, met with the cook, a conversation that was genuine, as Esther actually did want to learn new techniques, and in the evening asked if she could take a walk in the woods to gather certain herbs she needed for her own kitchen. The other cook, seeing no harm in this, agreed. Esther walked into the woods beyond the quarters. She had memorized the description of Josiah's grave location near a fallen oak tree, 50 yards from the eastern boundary, shallow enough that rain had partially exposed the body. She found the location as darkness fell. The grave was exactly as described. Parts of Josiah's body were visible through the disturbed soil. He had been buried face down, naked, his back still showing the marks of the whipping that had killed him. What Esther did next required a level of emotional detachment she could only achieve by dissociating completely from what she was doing. She could not think of this as desecrating a body. She could not think of Josiah as a person, as a human being who had suffered and died. She had to treat this as a necessary task, a procurement of materials, nothing more. She used a stolen knife to cut sections of flesh from Josiah's thighs and upper arms, parts where muscle mass was greatest and where removal would be least obvious if the grave was later examined. She wrapped the pieces in cloth she had brought. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Then she carefully recovered the grave, making the disturbance as minimal as possible. She walked back to the plantation quarters, hid the wrapped flesh in her traveling bag beneath her spare dress and other items, slept a few hours, and began the journey back to Whitmore Plantation the next morning. The return trip took another 2 days. When she arrived, she reported to Mistress Margaret that she had successfully learned the new ham preparation technique and looked forward to implementing it for Christmas. Margaret seemed pleased. Esther returned to her cabin. That night, Esther undertook the work that would have broken most people. Using techniques her mother had taught her about preserving meat, combined with knowledge gained from years of working in plantation kitchens, she carefully processed the flesh she had obtained. She removed any identifying characteristics, skin, obvious connective tissues that might look unusual. She cut the meat into portions that could be incorporated into larger dishes. She soaked the pieces in brine with heavy salt, pepper, and herbs, a preservation technique that also helped remove any unusual odors. She then smoked the meat over low heat for hours, using the fire pit in her cabin, creating a product that looked and smelled exactly like smoked pork or venison. The finished product was indistinguishable from any other preserved meat. Esther stored it wrapped in cloth in the coolest corner of her cabin. She had enough for approximately 8 to 10 portions, not sufficient for her ultimate plan, which required feeding many more people. She would need to obtain additional material. In November, Esther made a second trip, this time to the plantation where Ruth had been buried. The process was similar, a request to visit, a legitimate reason provided, permission granted, a nighttime trip to the burial site, careful procurement of flesh, preservation work back in her cabin. By mid-November, Esther had accumulated what she estimated was enough material to prepare dishes for approximately 20 people, assuming moderate portion sizes mixed with conventional meats to extend the quantity. The psychological toll of this work was immense. Esther had nightmares. She woke sweating, reliving the moments in those woods, seeing the faces of the dead. She performed ritual prayers in her cabin, asking forgiveness from the ancestors, explaining her purpose. She told herself that Josiah and Ruth were beyond suffering now, that their bodies were only vessels, that she was using their remains to strike back at the system that had killed them. She told herself this was justice, not desecration, but doubt haunted her. Was she doing something monstrous? Had the master's cruelty transformed her into something inhuman? Had she crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? She thought of her children. Samuel in Mississippi, Grace in New Orleans, Thomas in Cuba, all suffering, all beyond her reach, all stolen from her by Benjamin Whitmore's casual economic calculation. The doubt faded. Whatever she had become, the masters had made her, and they would pay. In early December, Benjamin Whitmore announced that the annual Christmas banquet would be held on December 24th, Christmas Eve rather than Christmas Day, because several guests had family obligations on Christmas and preferred to celebrate the evening before. The guest list would include approximately 14 people: Master Whitmore and Mistress Margaret, Caleb Morrison the overseer, 2 neighboring plantation owners named Edward Blackwell and Thomas Cunningham with their wives, a slave trader from South Carolina named Jonas Pritchard, who was visiting Atlanta on business, 2 drivers from Whitmore Plantation who would be allowed to eat with the whites as a reward for exceptional service, and 3 additional men, friends of Whitmore's from Atlanta, who were involved in cotton trading and banking. 14 people. Perfect. Esther had enough material. The banquet menu was discussed with Mistress Margaret in mid-December. It would be elaborate: roasted meats, ham, turkey, side dishes of vegetables, breads, desserts, wines, and bourbon. Esther was given a budget to purchase special ingredients from Atlanta markets. She was authorized to prepare the feast over several days, with final cooking and serving on December 24th. Esther began planning the meal with meticulous care. The challenge was incorporating her special ingredient in ways that would be impossible to detect. She decided on a multi-course approach. The human flesh would be mixed with conventional meats in several dishes, ensuring that every guest consumed it, but that no single dish was entirely composed of it, which might create unusual taste or texture that someone might notice. The first course would be a meat pie, a traditional southern dish with spiced ground meat enclosed in pastry. Esther would mix ground human flesh with ground pork, heavily seasoned with sage, thyme, black pepper, and cayenne. The pastry would be buttery and flaky. The combination of spices and conventional meat would make detection impossible. The second course would include sliced roasted meats. Esther would prepare a large roast using a technique called larding, inserting thin strips of fat into lean meat to add moisture and flavor during cooking. She would use this technique to insert strips of human flesh into a conventional pork roast. When sliced and served with gravy, the different types of meat would be visually and texturally indistinguishable. The third element would be added to the ham, the centerpiece of Christmas dinner in the South. Esther would prepare the ham using a technique she had genuinely learned from the other plantation's cook, injecting flavorful liquid deep into the meat before smoking. The injection mixture would include bourbon, brown sugar, spices, and finely minced human flesh that had been boiled down into a liquid consistency. This mixture, injected throughout the ham and then slow-cooked for hours, would be impossible to identify. The result would be a meal where every guest consumed human flesh multiple times across several courses without any possibility of detection. The human meat would comprise perhaps 15 to 20% of the total meat served, enough to be significant but not enough to dominate or create unusual flavors. For 3 days before Christmas Eve, Esther worked in the kitchen, preparing components of the feast. Her assistant cooks helped with various tasks, kneading bread dough, peeling vegetables, preparing desserts, but Esther personally handled all meat preparation, claiming that these dishes required her direct attention to achieve perfection. No one questioned this. She had earned complete trust regarding culinary matters. On December 23rd, Esther worked through the night. She ground meats, mixed seasonings, prepared the injection mixture for the ham, assembled the meat pies. She worked with total focus, her hands moving through familiar motions, her mind clear and cold. She thought of Samuel, she thought of Grace, she thought of Thomas, she thought of her mother Adaise dying in a dungeon far from home. She thought of every enslaved person who had suffered under these monsters. She thought of Josiah whipped to death and left in the woods. She thought of Ruth, dying in childbirth and buried in shame. She thought, this is for all of us. This is justice. On December 24th, the guests began arriving in the afternoon. Carriages pulled up to the big house, bringing plantation owners and their wives dressed in expensive gowns and suits. Jonas Pritchard, the slave trader, arrived on horseback, a large man with a red face and gold watch chain. The Atlanta friends arrived together, laughing and smoking cigars. By 5 o'clock, all 14 guests had assembled in the main parlor for pre-dinner drinks. Esther and her kitchen staff worked frantically preparing final elements of the meal. The ham had been smoking since dawn, filling the kitchen with the rich smell of wood smoke, bourbon, and spices. The meat pies were in the oven, their pastry turning golden brown. Roasted vegetables were being prepared, breads were being sliced, desserts waited on cooling racks. At 6 o'clock, the dinner began. The guests moved to the dining room, where the massive oak table had been set with the finest china, crystal, and silver. Candles provided warm light. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace. The atmosphere was festive. These were wealthy, powerful people gathering to celebrate their privilege, their success, their mastery over hundreds of enslaved human beings whose labor had created every bit of this luxury. The first course was served, the meat pies, steaming and aromatic, accompanied by a light salad and bread. The guests exclaimed over the quality. "Esther has outdone herself," Benjamin Whitmore said proudly. "This is extraordinary." The others agreed. They ate every bite. Some requested seconds. Esther, standing near the door to monitor service, watched them consume her creation. Her face showed nothing. The second course arrived. Sliced roasted meats arranged on platters with roasted potatoes, glazed carrots, and green beans cooked with bacon. The guests helped themselves generously, passing platters around the table, pouring gravy over everything. They ate with enthusiasm, talking and laughing between bites. Edward Blackwell raised his glass, a toast to Benjamin Whitmore, whose table is always the finest in Georgia. They drank, they ate, they consumed. The main course was brought in, the massive Christmas ham, glazed and studded with cloves, surrounded by roasted apples and root vegetables. Benjamin Whitmore personally carved it at the table, a tradition he enjoyed. He cut thick slices, serving each guest, pride evident in his face. "This ham is remarkable," Thomas Cunningham said. "What have you done differently this year?" Esther, asked to explain, described the injection technique she had learned, leaving out one ingredient. The guests nodded appreciatively. They ate until the platters were empty. The meal continued for 4 hours. Desserts were served, peach cobbler, pecan pie, pound cake. More bourbon was poured. The men retired to the study for cigars, while the ladies remained in the parlor. Conversations continued late into the evening. Everyone agreed it was the best Christmas celebration they had attended in years. By midnight, The guests began departing, thanking their hosts profusely. The slave trader Jonas Pritchard said, "I've eaten at fine establishments from South Carolina to Louisiana, and I can honestly say this was one of the most memorable meals of my life." He had no idea how true that statement was. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the big house was quiet. The guests had departed. Benjamin and Margaret Whitmore had gone to bed. Caleb Morrison had returned to his cabin. The kitchen staff had cleaned everything, washing dishes, storing leftovers, banking fires. Esther walked back to her cabin in the quarters. She should have felt triumphant. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt hollow, like someone who had accomplished a goal but lost herself in the process. She had done it. 14 people, including the master who had sold her children, the mistress who had called it prudent business, the overseer who had whipped her, the drivers who had collaborated in oppression, the neighboring masters who maintained the system, the slave trader who profited from separating families. All of them had consumed human flesh. All of them were now cannibals, violators of a fundamental taboo, permanently marked by an act they did not know they had committed. But completing the act was only half of Esther's plan. The revenge would be incomplete without revelation. The Whitmore family and their associates needed to know what they had done. They needed to face the horror of their actions. They needed to be destroyed not just physically, but psychologically and socially. Esther had planned this part carefully as well. She could not reveal the truth immediately. That would lead to her instant execution. But she could ensure that the truth would eventually emerge in a way that would maximize impact and minimize her own immediate danger. She had written a letter. Actually, she had dictated a letter to an enslaved man named Benjamin, not named after Benjamin Whitmore, but sharing the name by coincidence, who had secretly learned to read and write despite laws prohibiting slave literacy. Benjamin lived on a different plantation 20 miles away, and Esther had contacted him through the underground communication network, requesting his help. He had agreed, understanding the importance of her mission. The letter was addressed to a known abolitionist newspaper in Boston called The Liberator, edited by William Lloyd Garrison. The letter described in explicit detail what Esther had done, explained her motivations, named all the people who had consumed human flesh at the December 24th banquet, and provided enough specific details about the Whitmore plantation and its guests that verification would be possible. The letter was signed simply, "A Mother Seeking Justice." Benjamin, the literate enslaved man, had taken the letter and arranged through an incredibly complex chain of contacts, enslaved people who traveled between plantations, free black people in Atlanta who had limited mobility, and sympathetic whites involved in the Underground Railroad, to have the letter mailed from a location far from Georgia. It would take months for the letter to reach Boston, but once it did, the Liberator would publish it. The story would spread throughout the abolitionist press in the North. Eventually, it would reach Southern newspapers, who would have to report on the scandal. The revelation would destroy everyone involved, but Esther also created a more immediate mechanism for discovery. She kept samples of the prepared human flesh, small pieces she had not incorporated into the Christmas feast, stored in a sealed jar hidden in her cabin. She had also written a second document, a confession of sorts, explaining everything she had done, which she hid beneath a loose floorboard. If she was ever captured or killed for any reason, other enslaved people knew to search her cabin and find these items. The physical evidence and written confession could be delivered to authorities, creating an immediate scandal. This ensured that even if Esther died, the truth would still emerge. The days after Christmas were tense. Esther returned to her normal work routine, cooking daily meals for the Whitmore family, serving them as she always had, maintaining perfect submission. Benjamin and Margaret Whitmore seemed entirely normal. They had noticed nothing unusual about the Christmas feast. had no idea what they had consumed, continued their daily routines without concern. But Esther noticed changes in herself. She had trouble sleeping. When she did sleep, she dreamed of the woods, of the graves, of Josiah and Ruth and her own children blended together in nightmares that left her gasping. She found herself dissociating during work, her hands moving through cooking tasks while her mind was elsewhere. She had conversations with people, but later could not remember what was said. She was experiencing what we would now call trauma, the psychological cost of what she had done, the weight of crossing moral boundaries, the stress of living with a secret that could lead to her execution if discovered. 3 weeks after Christmas, in mid-January of 1855, something happened that Esther had not anticipated. Caleb Morrison fell seriously ill. He developed a high fever, severe vomiting and delirium. The plantation's overseer was incapacitated for a week. A doctor was called from Atlanta. The doctor examined Morrison, asked questions about recent diet and activities, and eventually diagnosed him with gastric fever, a broad term used in that era for various digestive system illnesses. Morrison slowly recovered over 2 weeks. Esther felt a moment of panic when Morrison fell ill. Had she made a mistake? Was there something in the meat that had caused disease? Would this lead to investigation? But as Morrison recovered and no one else showed symptoms, she realized it had been coincidental. Morrison had likely contracted some unrelated illness that had nothing to do with the Christmas feast. Still, the scare reminded her that she was constantly walking on the edge of discovery. In late January, another complication emerged. Margaret Whitmore announced that she was pregnant. This was surprising. She was 42 years old, had given birth 6 times previously, and everyone assumed her childbearing years were over, but the doctor confirmed it. Mistress Margaret was expecting a child in late summer. This pregnancy complicated Esther's emotional landscape in ways she had not expected. She found herself thinking, "This child will be born into wealth and privilege, will grow up free, will never face the horrors that Samuel, Grace, and Thomas are experiencing. This child's mother consumed human flesh while pregnant. This child is being nourished by meat that included the flesh of Josiah and Ruth. The symbolic weight was overwhelming. The system of slavery was literally consuming black bodies to sustain white comfort and white lineage. The cannibalism she had orchestrated was simply making literal and visible what had always been true metaphorically. White Southern wealth was built on consuming black lives, black labor, black suffering. Every comfortable white child in the South was nourished by violence against black children. February brought new tensions. A neighboring plantation experienced a slave rebellion. 3 enslaved men killed their overseer with farm tools and attempted to flee north. They were captured within 2 days by patrollers. The men were tortured for information about whether other enslaved people had been involved in planning. Under extreme torture, one man confessed, likely falsely, that there had been a broader conspiracy involving enslaved people from multiple plantations. This confession led to a wave of paranoia across Fulton County. Militia patrols increased. Restrictions on slave movement became even more severe. Multiple enslaved people from various plantations were arrested and interrogated. 2 were hanged publicly as examples. During this period of heightened surveillance and paranoia, Esther lived in constant fear. Any unusual behavior could trigger suspicion. Any connection to the men who had killed the overseer, however distant, could lead to interrogation. She maintained perfect submission, perfect obedience, worked harder than ever to demonstrate her loyalty to the Whitmore family. In March, Esther received devastating news through the underground communication network. Samuel was dead. He had died in Mississippi from a combination of exhaustion, malnutrition, and infected wounds. He was 15 years old. He had survived less than a year in the cotton fields. The source of this information was an enslaved man who had been recently purchased by Whitmore's neighbor and who had previously lived on the Mississippi plantation where Samuel had been sent. He had witnessed Samuel's death and remembered the boy mentioning his mother was a cook in Georgia. Esther absorbed this news in silence. She could not grieve openly. That would require explaining how she had received information about a child who had been sold away 11 months earlier. She could not scream or collapse or rage. She could only stand in her cabin, alone, and feel another piece of herself die. Her first child, her son, dead at 15, worked to death in fields that made white men rich. The guilt was crushing. If she had planned her revenge earlier, if she had acted when the children were first threatened, could she have prevented their sale? If she had found a way to escape with them, even knowing the dangers, would Samuel still be alive? The rational part of her mind knew that she was not responsible for Samuel's death. Benjamin Whitmore, the Mississippi plantation owner, the overseer who worked him to death, the entire system of slavery was responsible. But guilt does not listen to reason. That night, Esther returned to the jar where she had stored physical evidence of what she had done. She looked at the preserved flesh and thought, "This was for you, Samuel. This was justice for what they did to you. I made them cannibals. I made them monsters. I destroyed them even if they don't know it yet." In April, the letter reached Boston. The Liberator published it on April 15, 1855, under the headline, "Horrific Acts of Vengeance in Georgia. Enslaved cook claims to have served human flesh to masters at Christmas feast." The article included the full text of Esther's letter, the names of all the people who had attended the banquet, and an editorial from William Lloyd Garrison discussing the letter's authenticity and significance. Garrison wrote, "We cannot independently verify the claims made in this letter, but we know the institutions of slavery creates conditions where such acts become inevitable. When human beings are treated as property, when families are destroyed for profit, when all legal recourse is denied to the oppressed, we should not be surprised when the oppressed respond with desperate acts of resistance. The horror described in this letter, if true, is not primarily the responsibility of the enslaved woman who committed it, but of the system that created the conditions that drove her to such extremity. If white Americans are shocked by this story, they should direct their shock not at the actor, but at the institution of slavery itself, which has created a society where such horrors are possible. The letter and article created an immediate sensation in the Northern press. Other abolitionist newspapers reprinted it. Political speeches referenced it. Anti-slavery activists used it as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence. But crucially, it took weeks for the story to reach Southern newspapers, and when it did, the initial coverage was dismissive. Southern newspapers claimed the letter was abolition propaganda, a fabricated story designed to incite slave rebellion and demonize plantation owners. They argued that no such incident had occurred, that the named people were respectable citizens being slandered by Northern agitators, that the entire story was a lie. Benjamin Whitmore first learned of the letter in early May, when a friend from Atlanta visited and showed him a copy of a Southern newspaper's rebuttal article. The article quoted parts of Esther's original letter while arguing it was false. Whitmore read it and laughed. "This is absurd," he said. "Some abolitionist fanatic invents a grotesque story and attaches real names to make it seem credible. Obviously, it never happened. Our Christmas feast was excellent. Esther prepared her usual perfect meal. There was nothing unusual about it." His friend agreed. They discussed how ridiculous the abolitionists were, how desperate they must be to resort to such obvious fabrications. They never for a moment considered that the story might be true. But the story did not disappear. It continued to spread, growing with each retelling. By June, it had become a topic of conversation throughout the South, not because people believed it was true, but because everyone was talking about how ridiculous and offensive the abolitionist propaganda had become. Plantation owners discussed it at social gatherings, expressing outrage that anyone would believe such an obvious lie. Newspapers continued to publish rebuttals. Ministers gave sermons about how abolitionists were using blasphemous and disgusting stories to attack the divinely ordained institution of slavery. And throughout all of this, Esther cooked meals for the Whitmore family. She served them breakfast, dinner, and supper. She maintained perfect submission. She showed no unusual behavior. Benjamin and Margaret Whitmore never suspected that their cook, the woman who had served them faithfully for 16 years, was the author of the letter that had created such scandal. But Esther knew that revelation was inevitable. The letter was only the first step. Physical evidence still existed. Her written confession was still hidden in her cabin, and most importantly, she had shared enough information with a few trusted people in the enslaved community that the truth would eventually come out through multiple channels. The revelation came in July of 1855 in a way Esther had not predicted. A white man arrived at Whitmore Plantation claiming to be an investigator hired by several Georgia plantation owners to look into the Christmas feast story and definitively prove it was false. This investigator, whose name was recorded in later court documents as Charles Pemberton, had been paid to visit Whitmore Plantation, interview servants, examine records, and produce a report that could be published in Southern newspapers to counter the abolitionist propaganda. Pemberton spent 3 days at the plantation. He interviewed Benjamin and Margaret Whitmore, who insisted the Christmas feast had been normal and excellent. He interviewed Caleb Morrison, who confirmed that Esther had been a model servant since her return to work after being punished for the distress she showed when her children were sold. He interviewed Esther herself, asking her directly if she had any knowledge of the letter published in northern newspapers. Esther denied everything. She claimed she had never heard of any such letter, had no knowledge of any unusual circumstances surrounding the Christmas feast, had prepared the meal exactly as she always did, using conventional ingredients purchased from reputable suppliers. She showed appropriate confusion and offense at the suggestion that anything improper had occurred. Pemberton seemed satisfied. He prepared to write his report declaring the entire story a fabrication. But Pemberton made a mistake. He mentioned in passing to Caleb Morrison that part of his investigation involved searching the quarters for any written materials or unusual items that might indicate enslaved people were communicating with abolitionists or planning resistance. Morrison authorized the search. A group of patrollers accompanied Pemberton through the quarters, entering cabins, searching belongings, looking for anything suspicious. They found Esther's jar. They found her written confession under the floorboard. The discovery created immediate chaos. Pemberton seized the materials, confronted Esther directly, and presented the evidence to Benjamin Whitmore. Whitmore refused to believe it initially. He insisted there must be some mistake, some alternate explanation. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jar contained preserved flesh that appeared to be human. The written confession was detailed and specific. Esther, when confronted by multiple white men in the presence of physical evidence, finally admitted the truth. She told them everything. She described obtaining the flesh from the graves of Josiah and Ruth. She explained her preservation techniques. She detailed exactly how she had incorporated the human meat into the Christmas feast dishes. She named every person who had consumed it. She explained her motivations, the sale of her children, the whipping, her need for justice. She spoke calmly, without emotion, describing the process as if she were explaining a cooking recipe. The reaction was immediate and extreme. Benjamin Whitmore vomited. Margaret Whitmore fainted. Caleb Morrison drew his pistol and held it to Esther's head, ready to execute her on the spot, but Pemberton stopped him. He wanted Esther alive to testify, to provide evidence that could be used in legal proceedings. Jonas Pritchard, the slave trader who had attended the feast, was summoned from Atlanta. When told what he had consumed, he became hysterical, collapsed, and had to be restrained by multiple men. Within hours, word spread to all the other guests who had attended the Christmas banquet. Edward Blackwell, the neighboring plantation owner, shot himself in his study. His wife went into complete psychological breakdown and had to be institutionalized. Thomas Cunningham and his wife immediately left Georgia, abandoning their plantation, never to return. The two drivers from Whitmore Plantation, who had eaten with the whites, were beaten to death by a mob of white men, despite having had no knowledge of or involvement in Esther's actions. The Atlanta friends who had attended were socially ruined. Their businesses collapsed, their families ostracized, their names forever associated with the scandal. The psychological trauma was exactly what Esther had intended. These people would never eat comfortably again. Every meal for the rest of their lives would be contaminated by the memory of what they had unknowingly consumed. The horror would invade their dreams, poison their thoughts, destroy any peace. They had become the very monsters they accused enslaved people of being. Margaret Whitmore's pregnancy ended in miscarriage 3 days after the revelation. The shock and horror had been too much. The child, who had been literally nourished by human flesh while in the womb, died before birth. Margaret never fully recovered psychologically. She became a recluse, refused to leave her bedroom, spent her remaining years in a state of near catatonic depression. Benjamin Whitmore faced complete ruin. The scandal spread throughout Georgia and across the South. He was not charged with cannibalism. Legally, he was a victim, having consumed human flesh without knowledge or consent. But socially, he was destroyed. No one would do business with him. Former friends refused to speak to him. His reputation as a refined gentleman was replaced with a reputation as a cannibal. He tried to sell Whitmore Plantation and leave Georgia, but no one would buy property associated with such horror. Within 6 months, he faced bankruptcy. Within a year, he sold the plantation at a massive loss to a speculator from Charleston who planned to rename it and try to erase its history. The scandal affected slavery throughout the region. Plantation owners across Georgia and neighboring states became paranoid about their own cooks. Some fired all their enslaved kitchen workers and hired poor whites instead, despite the higher cost and lower skill. Others implemented elaborate security measures, tasters who sampled all food before it was served, multiple cooks who supervised each other, restrictions on kitchen access. The fear was pervasive and permanent. The story of Esther became a legend whispered throughout the enslaved community, a proof that resistance was possible, that the powerless could strike back at power in ways masters never imagined. But Esther paid the ultimate price. She was arrested immediately after her confession. She was held in the Fulton County Jail for 3 weeks, while authorities debated what charges to file. Cannibalism itself was not illegal, but murder was, and desecration of corpses was, and conspiracy to commit various crimes was. The legal questions were complex. Esther had not killed anyone, had not created new victims, had used bodies that were already dead. But she had clearly committed grave robbery, desecration of human remains, fraud, and various other offenses. The trial was held in early August of 1855. Esther was not allowed to testify in her own defense. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in Georgia courts. She was assigned a defense attorney who made minimal effort. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the confession, testimony from the investigator Charles Pemberton, and testimony from Benjamin Whitmore. The trial lasted 1 day. The all-white jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Esther guilty of multiple charges and recommended death by hanging. The sentencing was scheduled for August 15th. In the 2 weeks between conviction and execution, Esther remained in jail. She was visited by a minister who tried to get her to repent and seek forgiveness. Esther refused. "I did what I had to do," she told him. "They took my children. They destroyed my life. They got what they deserved. I ain't sorry. I'd do it again." The minister left shocked. She was visited by Charles Pemberton, the investigator who had developed a morbid fascination with the case. He asked her detailed questions about her methods, her motivations, her psychological state. Esther answered honestly. She explained her mother's teachings, Aunt Martha's final wisdom, the decision to choose resistance over survival. "I was dead anyway," she said. "My children gone. My husband separated from me. My whole life just cooking for people who treated me like property. What kind of life is that? At least this way," I fought back. "At least this way they'll never forget me." Pemberton eventually published these interviews in a book titled The Georgia Horror, a study of enslaved vengeance, which became notorious throughout the country. Abolitionists used it as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence on all involved, both enslaved and enslaver. Pro-slavery advocates used it as evidence that enslaved people were dangerous and required harsh control. Esther was also visited by Solomon. He traveled from Jameson Plantation with permission, claiming he wanted to say goodbye to his wife before execution. The guards allowed a brief meeting. Solomon held Esther's hands through the bars of her cell. They spoke quietly. "I'm proud of you," Solomon said. "You fought back when no one else could. You showed them we ain't just property, we're human beings who can choose resistance." Esther cried for the first time since the revelation. "Samuel dead," she said. "He died in those Mississippi fields. Worked to death at 15. I wanted justice for him. I wanted them to pay. But it don't bring him back. It don't save Grace or Thomas. I destroyed them, but I couldn't save my babies." Solomon held her. "You gave dignity to all of us," he said. "Every slave in Georgia heard your story. Every master in Georgia fears us now. You showed that we ain't powerless. That's worth something. That's worth everything." On August 15th, 1855, at dawn, Esther was taken from her cell to a public square in Atlanta, where a gallows had been constructed. Hundreds of people gathered. White people who wanted to watch justice carried out, enslaved people who'd been forced to attend as a warning against resistance, abolitionists who had traveled from the North to witness and document. The atmosphere was tense, angry, and sad. Esther was led up the steps to the platform. Her hands were bound behind her back. The noose was placed around her neck. A minister stood beside her and asked one final time if she had any last words, any repentance, any prayer for forgiveness. Esther looked out at the crowd. She saw enslaved people in the audience, forced to watch her death. She saw their faces, fear, grief, but also something else. Pride, admiration, recognition that she had done what they all dreamed of doing. She saw white faces, horror, satisfaction, but also fear. Fear that what she had done could be replicated, that their own cooks and servants might be planning similar resistance. She spoke clearly. "I did what I did for my children, Samuel, Grace, and Thomas. They were stolen from me by Benjamin Whitmore, sold away for money. I couldn't get them back. I couldn't protect them. Samuel dead now, worked to death at 15 years old. Grace and Thomas suffering somewhere I can't reach. So I made the people who did this pay. I made them into monsters. I made them eat what they created. A system that treats human beings like meat to be bought and sold. Y'all horrified by what I did? Good. Be horrified. Because this is what slavery creates. This is what happens when you treat people like property. You make us into things that will do anything to fight back. You made me. Now you got to live with what I became." She paused, looking directly at Benjamin Whitmore, who had been forced to attend the execution. "You thought you could take my children, and I'd just accept it. You thought you could whip me, and I'd just submit. You thought I was property, not a person. You were wrong. I'm human. I got intelligence. I got knowledge. I got the ability to choose resistance over survival. And I chose to make you pay. How that Christmas ham tastes now, Master? You ever going to forget what you ate? You ever going to sleep easy again? Good. Live with it. Die with it. Rot with it. The executioner prepared to pull the lever. Esther looked at the enslaved people in the crowd one more time. Don't forget, she said. Remember this. Tell the story. Let them know we can fight back. Let them fear us. We ain't property. We're human beings, and human beings fight back. The lever was pulled. Esther dropped. The noose tightened. She died within minutes. Her body was left hanging for 3 hours, as required by law, a warning to all enslaved people of the consequences of resistance. Then it was cut down and buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's cemetery outside Atlanta. But death was not the end of Esther's story. The legend grew. Enslaved people throughout the South told and retold her story in whispers after dark, in hush harbors where whites could not hear, in the coded lyrics of spirituals. The woman who made them eat themselves. The cook who served justice cold. The mother who took revenge for her stolen children. The story evolved with each telling, but the core remained. An enslaved woman had found a way to strike back at power, to make masters pay for their cruelty, to prove that the oppressed could resist in ways the oppressors never imagined. The story reached Solomon. He survived 11 more years of slavery, living to see the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the end of the Civil War in 1865. He gained his freedom at age 53. He immediately began searching for his children. He traveled through the South, visiting plantations, asking questions, following every lead. He never found Grace or Thomas. The records of where they had been sold, where they had ended up, whether they were alive or dead, had been lost in the chaos of war. He died in 1872, free, but never reunited with his family. The story reached abolitionists in the North. They debated its meaning. Some argued it was evidence of slavery's brutalizing effect on everyone involved, proving that the institution corrupted both enslaved and enslaver. Others argued it was justified resistance, that when all legal and peaceful means of justice are denied, human beings will resort to extreme measures. The debate continued for decades. The story reached historians. In later years, as scholars began studying the lived experiences of enslaved people rather than just the economic and political history of slavery, Esther's story became a case study. Was this resistance or revenge? Was it moral or immoral? Was it a legitimate response to an illegitimate system or a crime that crossed fundamental human boundaries? The questions remained unanswered because they are ultimately unanswerable. There is no clean moral framework that can adequately address a situation as fundamentally immoral as slavery itself. What is clear is that Esther's actions had lasting impact. The fear she planted in the hearts of Southern masters was real and permanent. Plantation kitchens became spaces of suspicion rather than simple domestic work. The trust that masters had placed in enslaved servants was shattered. The myth of the faithful servant who accepted slavery with gratitude was revealed as propaganda. Enslaved people had agency, intelligence, and the capacity for elaborate resistance. Masters would never again be able to ignore that reality. The scandal also contributed, in a small way, to the growing tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The story circulated widely in the North, strengthening abolitionist arguments that slavery created conditions so horrific that desperate acts of resistance were inevitable. It contradicted pro-slavery arguments that enslaved people were content, that the institution was benevolent, that masters and slaves had harmonious relationships. The Christmas feast of 1854 became a symbol, grotesque and disturbing, but undeniably powerful, of slavery's fundamental violence and the resistance it provoked. Benjamin Whitmore died in 1859, 4 years after Esther's execution, at age 53. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who knew him said he had never recovered from the scandal. He had become a broken man, isolated from society, financially ruined, psychologically destroyed by the knowledge of what he had consumed and what his actions had provoked. His obituary in Atlanta newspapers was brief and avoided mentioning the Christmas feast, but everyone who read it knew. His legacy was not as a refined gentleman or successful planter, but as the cannibal master, the man who had eaten human flesh and lived to know it. Margaret Whitmore died in 1862 during the Civil War, in the bedroom where she had spent most of her final years. She was 50 years old. Her death certificate listed the cause as melancholia, a term used then for severe depression. She had never recovered from the miscarriage, the revelation, or the psychological trauma. Her final years were spent in almost total isolation, refusing visitors, barely eating, existing in a state of profound despair. Caleb Morrison left Georgia in 1856 and never returned. He moved west, changing his name, trying to escape the association with Whitmore Plantation. He died in Kansas in 1864 during the border conflicts that preceded the Civil War, killed by anti-slavery guerrillas who recognized him from wanted posters describing his role as an overseer who had tortured enslaved people. His death was not gentle. The 2 drivers who had been killed by the white mob in the immediate aftermath of the revelation were buried in unmarked graves. Their names are not recorded in any surviving documents. They were casualties of white rage, scapegoats for crimes they had not committed, victims of a system that used black bodies as outlets for white anger and fear. Esther's assistant cooks, Dinah and the others who had worked in the kitchen, were questioned extensively but eventually cleared of involvement. They had genuinely known nothing about Esther's plans. They continued working for whoever eventually purchased Whitmore Plantation, carrying the secret knowledge that they had served meals prepared by a woman who had committed one of the most audacious acts of resistance in the history of American slavery. The modern legacy of Esther's story is complicated. For descendants of enslaved people, she represents resistance, agency, and the refusal to accept oppression passively. She proves that enslaved people were not victims without power, but human beings who found ways to fight back even in the most oppressive conditions. For descendants of slaveholders, those willing to confront this history honestly, she represents the consequences of treating human beings as property, the inevitable resistance that oppression creates, the moral rot at the heart of slavery. For historians, Esther represents a challenge. How do we tell stories of extreme resistance without sensationalizing violence? How do we honor the agency of enslaved people while acknowledging the moral complexity of acts like hers? How do we understand the psychological state of someone pushed to such extremity? These questions resist simple answers. What cannot be disputed is that Esther was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, patience, and determination. She mastered multiple complex skills: cooking, herb knowledge, anatomy, preservation techniques, strategic planning, psychological manipulation. She maintained a perfect facade for months while implementing an elaborate plan. She understood the vulnerabilities in the system of slavery and exploited them brilliantly. She was not a victim without agency. She was a strategic thinker who made difficult choices under impossible conditions. Her story also reveals something important about the nature of slavery itself. The institution depended on proximity, on enslaved people working in intimate spaces with masters, preparing their food, caring for their children, knowing their habits and vulnerabilities. This proximity was supposed to create control, but it also created opportunity. The very structure of slavery, the dependence of masters on enslaved labor, meant that enslaved people had access to resources and information that could be weaponized. Esther understood this and used it. In the decades after Esther's execution, the story took on new meanings with each generation. During Reconstruction, it was told as a cautionary tale about the violent passions slavery had unleashed. During Jim Crow, it was suppressed by white historians who wanted to promote the myth of the lost cause and the happy slave. During the Civil Rights Movement, it was rediscovered by scholars interested in recovering hidden histories of black resistance. In our contemporary moment, it serves as a reminder that oppression creates resistance, that systems of violence generate counter-violence, that human beings pushed to extremity will respond with extremity. The descendants of Samuel, Grace, and Thomas, if they existed, if those children survived and had children of their own, would be alive today. Part of the millions of black Americans whose family trees include branches broken by slavery, names lost, connections severed. They would carry Esther's DNA, her resilience, her refusal to accept oppression. They would be her legacy, proof that even when the system tried to destroy black families, something survived. If you're feeling disturbed by this story, that's appropriate. This is disturbing history. This is the reality of what slavery created. A system so violent, so dehumanizing, so fundamentally evil that it drove human beings to acts of desperate resistance that violated every moral boundary. Esther's story should make us uncomfortable. It should challenge our simple narratives about heroic resistance and passive victims. It should force us to confront the moral complexity of extreme oppression and extreme response. But if you're feeling that Esther's actions were unjustifiable, ask yourself, what would justify them? What level of oppression excuses resistance? If not the sale of her children, what? If not the destruction of her family, what? If not 200 years of slavery, what? Where is the line where we say, yes, this person had the right to fight back in any way available to them? The truth is that there is no clean moral framework for understanding slavery and its resistances. The institution itself was so immoral that any response to it exists in moral terrain that defies simple judgment. We can acknowledge that what Esther did was extreme, was horrifying, crossed fundamental taboos, and simultaneously acknowledge that the system she was responding to was worse, had done worse to millions of people for centuries, and had left her with no legitimate alternatives. This is the history that made America. Not just the plantations and the cotton and the wealth extracted from black bodies, also the resistance, the rebellions, the acts of vengeance, the refusal to submit, the determination to fight back, even when fighting back meant crossing lines that should never be crossed. This is the full story. This is the truth that cannot be sanitized or simplified. Remember Esther. Remember her intelligence, her determination, her refusal to accept what was done to her and her children. Remember that she was not an exception. She was one of millions of enslaved people who found ways to resist, to fight back, to assert their humanity in a system designed to destroy it. Remember that the end of slavery in 1865 did not end the legacy of slavery, that we still live with its consequences, that racism and inequality and injustice continue because the systems and ideologies that sustained slavery were never fully dismantled. Remember Samuel, who died at 15 in a Mississippi cotton field. Remember Grace, sold to a New Orleans brothel at 11 years old. Remember Thomas, shipped to Cuba at 7 to cut sugarcane. Remember Josiah, whipped to death and left in the woods. Remember Ruth, who died in childbirth and was buried in shame. Remember the millions whose names we don't know, whose stories were never recorded, whose resistance was invisible or forgotten or deliberately erased. This is American history. This is the foundation. This is the truth. And the only way to honor these stories, the only way to give meaning to this suffering, is to ensure it never happens again, not slavery itself, which ended in 1865, but the systems of oppression and dehumanization that continue in different forms. Mass incarceration, police violence, economic exploitation, educational inequality, healthcare disparities, voting restrictions. All of these are legacies of slavery, echoes of the same ideology that treated black people as property rather than humans. The fight that Esther began, the fight for dignity, for recognition of full humanity, for justice, continues. Different battlefield, same war. She fought with the tools available to her in 1854. We fight with the tools available to us now. But we fight, we resist, we refuse to accept oppression. We honor her memory by continuing her work. What did we learn from Esther's story? What do you take from it? How does it change your understanding of slavery, of resistance, of justice? These are questions you need to answer for yourself. These are conversations we need to have with our families, our communities, our society. These are the truths we need to face if we're ever going to build a country that lives up to its claimed ideals. Esther's story doesn't have a happy ending. Very few stories from slavery do, but it has meaning. It has power. It refuses to be forgotten. And that refusal, that insistence on being remembered, on being known, on having the truth told, is itself a form of resistance that continues to this day. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged you, then leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. Tell us, was Esther's revenge justified? What would you have done in her place? How should we remember stories like this? And most importantly, what are you doing today to fight against the systems of oppression that are slavery's legacy? Subscribe to this channel if you want more hidden histories, more stories of resistance, more truths that textbooks won't teach you. Hit that like button if you believe these stories matter. Share this video with someone who needs to know this history. Turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming episodes. Because the only thing worse than confronting this difficult history is forgetting it. The only thing worse than knowing what happened is pretending it didn't. The only thing worse than feeling uncomfortable about America's past is remaining comfortable with America's present. Remember Esther, tell her story, continue her fight. That's how we honor her. That's how we honor them all.